Good morning, Prairie. This is Pastor Chris, and I'd like to welcome you to our online service. We are continuing our series entitled Let's Talk About It, Stigmas in the Church. And this is a series where we're dealing with the taboo topics that, we don't like to talk about in church, and we're talking about them. And, I've enjoyed it so far. We've dealt with some kind of heavy topics, anxiety, depression, even suicide. And then last week, Pastor Dan dealt with divorce. And next week, we're going to be talking about special needs, which is a heavy topic kind of in a different way. A challenge that many families face and many churches don't address. And I say all of that because this week, this message that I'm about to share with you was actually supposed to be the last message in the series as kind of a lighter topic to end kind of on an encouraging note. But with our scheduling and one of our guest speakers, it was going to work out better for them to be here next week. So you're getting this message this week. But I still think it's going to be good. And the topic that we're going to be discussing, ageism. The idea of being judged or excluded just because of your age. Now, you might not think that sounds like a serious topic. You're like, that's not a stigma. That's not a taboo topic in the church. Is it really important to address this? And to that, I would say yes. While on one hand, maybe we're not as hesitant to talk about age as we are some of these other topics. On the other hand, I encourage you that next time you show up at Cobb Prairie during the welcome time, maybe just start walking up to people and asking how old they are and seeing how well that goes over. It'll probably get pretty tense pretty quickly because the truth is that we are uncomfortable talking about age. And sad truth is, sometimes we feel excluded because of our age. And this happens in the church. Sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally. Sometimes there are churches that maybe it's an older congregation and they don't want to deal with change. And so they don't want younger people to show up. They want to, bring in people that are of the same age that they are. Or I've also seen other churches where they really want young people. They want to seem like the cool, hip church. And so they set up programs and put people on stage to make it seem like there's only young people there. And then you find yourself walking in the door, not a part of one of the targeted age groups, and you don't feel at home. Maybe you've felt this before. In fact, click the heart button if you've experienced this before, where you have gone into a setting and then realized that you were not a part of the targeted age group. For any of you parents out there, maybe you've experienced this when you've been at the park, at the playground, or maybe you're at McDonald's with an indoor play area, or Cobb Prairie for that matter, and your kid really wants you to join in, and so after a little while you agree, and next thing you know, you're climbing through plastic tubes and crawling up nets that are clearly not made for someone your size, and then you start looking around and you realize that you're surrounded by 5 or 6 or 7-year-olds, and you realize that you are not the targeted age group for where you are. Or on the other end of the spectrum, I just spent the past week at a church conference with Pastor Dan. And it was a Lutheran gathering at the Lake of the Ozarks. And my wife Sally and I often joke when I go to these because I am often the kid in the room, which makes no sense because I am 39, but the average age is quite a bit higher than 39, and I find myself making pop cultural references that nobody gets. All that to say, it doesn't feel good when you're someplace where you know that your age group isn't as welcome as others, or maybe even it's excluded. And if we're going to be a church that says there's a seat for you, that everyone is welcome, then we need to make sure that every age feels welcome and included and knows that they are a vital, important part of the church. And so today, that's what we're going to be addressing. I'm going to preach, I was going to say this message, but I'm actually going to kind of preach 3 little mini messages targeted at 3 different age groups. We're going to talk about the young, and then we're going to talk about the old, and then we're going to talk about the awkward. And I'll explain that when we get there. And to do this, we're going to be using a couple books in the New Testament. There are actually a couple of letters that Paul wrote to a young minister named Timothy. And, well, this is Paul, one of the biggest leaders in the early church, wrote nearly 2/3 of the New Testament. And yet you can tell he cares about Timothy on a very deep personal level. In the beginning of 1 Timothy, he calls him my true son in faith. In the beginning of 2 Timothy, he says, I long to see you again, for I remember your tears as we parted, and I'll be filled with joy when we are together again. These are heartfelt letters written to somebody that, well, Paul really cares about and wants to use to change the world. And I feel that these letters contain wisdom for each of these age groups that we're going to be talking about. So let's dive in. All right, the first group that we're going to be talking about is the young. And I'm starting with this age group for a reason, because I believe that there is a sense of urgency here. See, young people are leaving the church in greater numbers now than ever before. I mean, several studies done by several different organizations all come to about the same conclusion, that after high school, only about 30% of our youth that were attending church continue to attend church. Some of them still identify as a Christian, but they stop coming to a local faith community. And then some of them leave the faith altogether. And, well, this breaks my heart. All of this is leading to Gen Z being the least church generation ever. And I say all of this not because I think you have to go to church to be a Christian. I don't believe that. I believe that there are Christians all over the world that for whatever reason can't go to church. But, well, I believe there's a lot of value in the church. I believe that the church is the place that we go to find hope and be reminded of the good news and to be connected to our Christian family that can support us through the good and bad of life. And I feel like that's something that everyone should have in their life, especially Gen Z. Because this is a generation that is dealing with anxiety and depression and even suicide at higher rates than any generation before them. I feel like they need Jesus. They need the hope that comes from the good news that Jesus has to offer to us. And I believe that the best place to find that hope is the church. And so I think it's essential that churches, ours included, stop and ask, what can we do to make sure that every youth that walks through that door knows that there is a seat for them and that they are welcome here? And I think there's actually 2 things that we can do that can make a huge impact. Number 1, we can accept them, even when we don't understand them. Look, I know that it's easy to look at younger generations and say, I don't get the stuff that they're into or the stuff that they're going through. And because we don't get it, we sometimes are a little slow to accept them. I've seen this time and time again. And I think we undervalue the power of acceptance. Sometimes I think that we're so scared that maybe what they're going through, what they're dealing with is a sin, and we feel called as Christians to reject that sin, that we sometimes end up rejecting them too. And I think that Paul actually speaks to this, well, in both of the letters that he writes. In 1 Timothy 1:15, he says, "This is a trustworthy saying, and everyone should accept it. Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, and I am the worst of them all." Now, like I said, this is Paul, the guy who helped found the early church, who wrote nearly 2/3 of the New Testament. And here he is saying that we're all sinners, and in fact, I am the worst of them. And then he says, this is something you should remember. And I think he wants us to remember this to humble us, to make sure that we never get to the point that we forget that we're sinners, or we start thinking that everybody else is a worse sinner than we are. It's a way of humbling us. And so even as we look at youth, even if we feel like whatever it is a sin, Paul tells us to be slow in judging that sin. In his next letter, he goes on and he says in 2 Timothy 2, starting in verse 23, "Again, I say, don't get involved in foolish, ignorant arguments that only start fights." I think a lot of Christians need to hear that. And I actually think this next verse might be one of the hardest verses in the New Testament. He says, "A servant of the Lord must not quarrel, but must be kind to everyone, be able to teach, and be patient with difficult people." He says, "Gently instruct those who oppose the truth, and perhaps God will change those people's hearts and they will learn the truth." So once again, even if we feel like whatever our youth are dealing with or going through, even if it is a sin, Paul says that we need to have patience and gentleness as we try to instill the truth into their life. And like I said, I believe that begins with acceptance. And I believe that we undervalue the power of acceptance. Go out and have a conversation with any of our youth, and it will not take long for you to hear, maybe under the surface a little, but a cry for acceptance. Our youth today often feel rejected, whether that's at home or school or work, or just that they don't fit in to society. And what if the church could become the place where they knew they would be accepted? You know, just recently I heard through the grapevine about one of our own youth that went here to Caw Prairie. And they were going through a transition in their life. A transition that a lot of older people didn't understand. A transition that, I'll be honest, I didn't completely understand. It's not something that I've gone through myself. But we tried hard to accept them. And as a result, what I heard through the grapevine is that because of that acceptance, I said that because I was accepted, I am still a believer today. And I believe that that is not a unique story, but it's something that this generation desperately needs. And it's something that we can give them. And so I believe that we can become a church where every youth that walks through the door knows that there is a seat for them. And maybe that seat is next to you. And then Paul goes on with the second thing here. And it comes from quite possibly the most famous words of Paul's letters to Timothy. In 1 Timothy 4, starting in verse 12, he's writing to this young minister. And he says, "Don't let anyone think less of you because you are young, but be an example to all believers in what you say, in the way you live, in your love, your faith, and your purity. Until I get there, focus on reading the scriptures to the church, encouraging the believers, and teaching them." Now, what I love about this is Paul is telling this young minister, you be the example. You be the teacher. You be the leader in the church. You know, I've shared this quote before. I'm going to share it again. A few years ago, I was at a youth convention. One of the speakers got up and he said, "I want you to know that the youth here are not the future of the church." Now, as a youth pastor at the time, I was pretty upset by that statement. I was kind of taken aback. I'm like, where are you going with this? And then he said, "No, the youth here are the church. That really hit me, because I think one of the things that we need to do is to not baby our youth, but to include them, to let them lead, to let them be the ministers, to let them know that this isn't something that you're going to grow up and be a part of. This is something that you can be a part of right now. Now, that takes a certain level of grace and a certain willingness to give up some control. If we put youth in positions of leadership, we might see things change. We might experience things that aren't done exactly like we would like them to be done. But I promise you that if we start letting you set the example, be the leaders, be the ministers, it can transform a church, and it can transform a generation, knowing that if they come into the church, there's going to be a place for them, not to be a spectator, but to be a participator, to be a leader. And I dream about that for Kaw Prairie. I would love to walk into this church and to be greeted by one of our youth, to walk up to the cafe to order my coffee, clearly not a pumpkin spice coffee, but any other drink, and it to be served by one of our youth, to walk into the worship center and see youth playing and singing on the stage. Or you know what? Some week, I would like to see, youth preaching the message, and me and Pastor Dan sitting and learning from them. So I really believe those are two things that we can do that will help the young, the next generation coming up, be a part of our church. We can accept them and we can give them a place where they can lead. And so, this is the end of, the first message. So let's move on. All right, now let's talk about the old. Now, I'm not going to name any names because I wouldn't want somebody like Patty Garrity to feel bad, so I'm not going to do that. In fact, I'm not even going to put an age, a number on this, because I think you know who you are. Yeah, you get discounts at restaurants when you go out to eat. You go to bed before I go out to eat. But you've also made my generation who they are. And that's actually where I'm going to start here, because one of the things that I love about how Paul writes to Timothy is that in the beginning of the second letter, he has this great line here. He says, I remember your genuine faith, for you share the faith that first filled your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice. And I know that same faith continues strong in you. That is why I remind you to fan into flames the spiritual gift God gave you when I laid hands on you. For God has not given us a spirit of fear and timidity, but of power, love, and self-discipline. In other words, Timothy's ministry wouldn't exist if it wasn't for his mother's faith, and his mother's faith wouldn't exist if it wasn't for his grandmother's faith. And I think that that is true of people in churches all over the world. It is the faith of our elders that has made us who we are today. But what breaks my heart is that oftentimes I hear those elderly individuals in our church saying that they feel like there's no longer a place for them, that things have changed or they've moved on and they don't feel like they fit in, maybe like they once did. And if you've ever felt that, especially here at Kaw Prairie, I am sorry, because we need you. We need you now more than ever. I believe that your faith, the strength of your faith, is exactly what the younger generations today need. In fact, there was a great article on Christianity Today, and I love the name of the article. It says, the casserole-toting church ladies hold the secret to happiness. And it's a story of a minister. And one of the churches down the street from their church ended up closing up. And it was an older church. And so she said all of a sudden one week, the elderly population of their church grew quite a bit. And these little old ladies started showing up at the church, casseroles in hand, coming to the prayer meetings, coming to the classes, and being a part of everything. And she said it was their faith that transformed her faith. It was hearing their stories of endurance and perseverance, hearing about all the trials and the challenges that they had faced that really hit her. And I think we need that. You know, there's another story I remember of one of the Christian writers that I love, and he actually talks about a group of high school girls. And these were high school girls that were looking to do something in their community, and they loved doing makeup. They were the kind of girls that had like TikTok channels that were all about just like makeover stuff. Like that's who this group was. And so what they decided to do was to go to a local nursing home. And they went into that nursing home and they just asked for a list of who's the least visited women here and can we meet with them? And so they went door to door and asked, hey, would you like a makeover? And they started giving makeovers. And next thing you know, every other week, one day they were showing up and they were doing makeovers. And as they did, they started to hear the stories of these women. And they started realizing that they had a lot to learn. That some of the very issues that they were dealing with in life that maybe they thought were new are not as new as they thought. And that, well, there are wisdom of those who've gone through it before them. And like I said, I think our church needs that. I think our church needs your perseverance and your encouragement. I can't tell you how many struggling couples in this church could be profoundly impacted by seeing a marriage that has endured hardships more than we can even imagine. I think that there are people in this church that, well, they're trying to figure out how to raise their kids and they have no idea what they're doing. And having one of the old people in the church come up and tell them, hey, you're doing all right, could profoundly impact them and give them the encouragement that they need. And I can tell you, from knowing my own grandparents' faith, knowing my wife Sally's grandparents' faith, and knowing enough old people who have faith to tell you that nobody prays like they pray. They came up in a generation that valued prayer. And I know that if I ever need prayer in this church, that is one group within this church that I can turn to and know that they are going to be prayer warriors. And so, I hope you know how valued you are. And I know it can be difficult. I know things do change, and I know that change can be hard, and I know that you can get frustrated, and well, I understand. But I also hope you know how much we need you, and we need you to share your story. All right, the last group that I want to talk to is the group that I labeled the awkward. And I'll explain why. You are typically the individuals that are between 25 and 45. And the reason that I'm calling us awkward, well, it's partly because we have no idea what we're doing. We're still trying to figure out life. And I don't know about you, but sometimes I feel like I'm pretty far away from figuring it out. If you can relate to that at all, just please click the heart button to let me know that I am not alone. But here's also why I think sometimes we feel a little awkward in our age group. Because, well, churches think we're sexy. And what I mean by that is that we are the age group that so many churches want in their building. They want the young adults so that they can appear to be the cool, hip, upcoming church. And they want the young families because that's what drives children and youth ministries and makes things seem vibrant. We are the group that so many churches are trying so hard to bring into everything they are doing. But, well, we're dying. We are living life at a pace that we weren't meant to live. Now, let me try to explain, and I think maybe some of you can relate to this. See, our current work system was kind of set up so that, well, one spouse would work and then one spouse would be a caretaker. But that's not the situation anymore. In fact, most families, both spouses are working one, if not multiple, jobs. And then that brings in childcare, which is expensive and sometimes complicated. And then on top of that, there are more extracurricular activities for our kids than there have ever been before. And there's more pressure for them to be involved in those activities than ever before. And we're taking those activities more seriously than we have ever before. And so next thing you know, you're running to things after school and before school. You're renting an instrument. You're a part of a club team. And, well, Wednesdays and Sundays aren't as sacred as they used to be. In fact, you might be wondering why this video looks different, because this does not look like the church. And you're right, it's not the church, it's my couch in my living room. Because like I said, I was at a church conference all week that left my wife working a full-time job, acting as a single parent, trying to get my daughter to all the activities that she has to go to. My wife is also a cheer coach and was busy with that. And then I came back, and then Friday evening we had a Team World Vision dinner. And then this morning we had the Team World Vision half marathon and marathon. Props to all the runners that completed that race, but I was there volunteering, and then I got home, and then we had a cheer game this evening that my wife was coaching at, my daughter was cheering at, and by the time I got home, it was too late for me to get to the church, and so here I am. Now, why do I say all of this? Because one, I think that maybe some of you that fall into that age group are also experiencing this. And it puts us in an awkward place with our relationship with the church. The church wants us to join in, but oftentimes life seems to prevent us from joining in, and it just leaves us feeling guilty. And, well, what do I say to this age group? Well, the same thing I've been saying to the other age groups. That there's a seat for you. There's a seat for you when you feel like you've got it all together, and there's a seat for you when you feel like you are a hot mess. You don't have to show up at church looking like you're on top of things. In fact, you can join in your pajamas online any week, and you are still fully a part of what we're doing here at Caw Prairie. If you can only show up one Sunday a month, I want you to know that we want you there that Sunday. And we're not going to make you feel guilty for the other 3 Sundays. We know that the world is crazy, that you are living life at a pace you were never meant to live. But I still believe that the faith can and should be a part of your life. You know, Paul has these powerful words at the end of 1 Timothy. In chapter 6, verse 11, he says, "But you, Timothy, are a man of God. So run from these evil things. Instead, pursue righteousness and a godly life, along with faith, love, perseverance, and gentleness. Fight the good fight for the true faith. Hold tightly to eternal life for which God has called you, which you have declared so well for many witnesses." In other words, pursue, endure, keep going. I know that it is tough and it is easy for faith to be the thing that gets pushed aside. But keep going and don't give up, because I believe that, well, we need Jesus. You know, Paul says in his second letter here, he says in chapter 2, verse 4, he says, "Soldiers," referring to Christians, "don't get tied up in the affairs of civilian life, for then they cannot please the officer who enlisted them." In other words, don't get so caught up in everyday life that we forget the God that we serve. And I know that that is hard, because sometimes you have days that end with you having to preach on a couch. But even on those days, remember what this is all about. And if you need a church to help you remember, we want to be that church. We want you to know that there is a seat for you. In fact, I hope that this is a church that when you walk in, there are going to be youth, that keep you from getting cynical, that remind you to be hopeful, and that there are going to be elders who sit by you and share their story, reminding you that you can get through this. And so, we've talked about the young, we've talked about the old, we've talked about the awkward. And I'm going to conclude with this. Paul, one more time, in the 5th chapter of his first letter, he says this: "Never speak harshly to an older man, but appeal to him respectfully as you would your own father. Talk to younger men as you would your own brothers. Treat older women as you would your mother. And treat younger women with all the purity as you would your own sisters." What I love about the language that Paul uses there is it's the language of a family. And I view church as a family gathering. We often use the image of the table to talk about church. And there are different kind of tables. Sometimes the table feels a little rushed. You're trying to get from one activity to another, and the people barely sit, we barely talk to each other, and then we're off. I don't think that's the kind of table the church is. I think it's more like a Thanksgiving table or a Christmas table, where it is full of people of all generations telling stories, getting caught up with one another. There's always the crazy uncle there. We're all together representing each generation, making the family a whole. And I think that is the image that God wants us to have of the church. And I think that when we have that image, it becomes a very appealing place where the world looks and says, I want to be a part of that. I need to be a part of that. And so I hope this message, as part of this series of Let's Talk About It and talking about these topics we don't often talk about, I hope that as we talked about age, that at each of the age groups that might be listening to this, I hope each of you know that there is a place at Cobb Prairie for you and the unique qualities that you bring to our family. So, thanks for joining us today and being a part of Cobb Prairie.